You know the Vikings, dragon ships, brutal warriors, explorers who reached America 500 years before Columbus, but nobody talks about the other cargo those longships carried. The children who disappeared from coastal villages across Europe, the trading posts where young boys were selected for a fate worse than death, the river routes to the east where humans became currency. Who were these children? Where did they go? What happened when the Rus merchants needed something the Arab world would pay gold for? Between 800 and 1000 ADE, the slave trade was one of the main economic engines of the Viking world. Not furs, not amber, people. And the routes going east through Russia to Baghdad and Byzantium were the most profitable of all. The Volga trade route connected Scandinavia to the Caspian Sea, and the Rus, who controlled it, had one commodity the Islamic world craved above all others: young males. Specifically, young males who could be turned into eunuchs. If you value documented historical evidence like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Mary Volante's peer-reviewed article, Castrating Monks, Vikings, Slave Trade, and the Value of Eunuchs, published in Castration and Culture in the Middle Ages by Cambridge University Press in 2013, and from the Cambridge World History of Slavery Volume 2, published in 2021, alongside archaeological data from Viking settlements across the Volga route. These aren't popular history sources. These are academic publications that document what actually happened. Now back to the information. The Ruses established their first settlement at Ladoga, 10 kilometers south of where the Volkhov River meets Lake Ladoga, sometime around 800 AD. Archaeological evidence shows Arabic coins at Timirevo, near Yaroslavl, dated to 804 and 805. The trade route was already functioning. From Ladoga, they traveled up the Volkhov to Novgorod, across Lake Ilmen, along the Lovat River, then a 3-kilometer portage to reach the Volga headwaters. From there, the route ran through Finnic and Permian territories down to Volga, Bulgaria, where 2 trading cities, Bulgar and Suvar, served as major exchange points. Then south through Khazar lands to the Caspian Sea and onward to Baghdad. The Persian geographer Ibn Rusta wrote about what he saw sometime around 930. He documented the Rus communities living along the Volga, and he didn't soften his words. They sail their ships to ravage the Sokolaba, the surrounding Slavs, and bring back captives whom they sell at Kazaran and Bulgar. They have no estates, villages, or fields. Their only business is trading in sable, squirrel, other furs, and the money they take in these transactions they stow in their belts. The captives. Always the captives. In 921, Ahmad ibn Fadlan traveled as part of a diplomatic delegation from the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadir to Volga, Bulgaria. He kept detailed records. He met Rus traders on the river. He watched how they operated. He described slave girls, undoubtedly of Slavic origin, being sold at the markets. He noted that when a Rus chief died, a slave girl was chosen to follow him into death. The funeral ritual he witnessed was specific, detailed, brutal. The girl was given alcohol, passed from tent to tent where men had intercourse with her, then strangled and stabbed while being held down on the funeral ship. Johannes Brunstad, analyzing Ibn Fadlan's account in 1965, interpreted it as evidence that these Rus retained their Scandinavian customs regarding ship burials and human sacrifice. Swedish archaeology confirms male slaves were killed to follow masters into the afterlife. Norwegian excavations found a female burial where the throat was slit in a manner matching Ibn Fadlan's description. The Annals of Ulster, an early medieval Irish chronicle, documented what happened closer to home. In 821, they recorded a raid near Dublin at a place called Atar. The heathens plundered it and carried off a great number of women into captivity. Great number. Not a dozen, not a handful. A century later, the same chronicle documented a single attack that captured 3,000 people. 3,000. From one raid, the scale was industrial, but the slave trade wasn't just about domestic labor or sacrificial victims. The real money was in a specialized market. Eunuchs, the Byzantine Empire needed them for imperial administration. Some military commanders were eunuchs. In the Eastern Church, eunuchs could rise to patriarch. The Abbasid Caliphate needed them even more. When the Caliph created his harem in Baghdad, there was massive demand for trustworthy guards. Eunuchs filled that role. They served women and children, acted as teachers, moved into bureaucratic positions, worked in regional palaces. Not all were successful. Some ended up as entertainers or prostitutes in lower neighborhoods. But the successful ones could accumulate enormous wealth and power. Mary Volante, professor of history at Appalachian State University, documented how this demand changed Viking raiding patterns. Viking raids began barely a generation after the Abbasid dynasty seized the caliphate. The timing isn't coincidence. Volante's research, published in 2013 in an academic volume on castration in medieval culture, shows that one of the main reasons for the rise in attacks against monasteries from Ireland to France was to capture literate young males who could be turned into eunuchs and sold off to the east. A 10th century biography of Saint Nian records 200 churchmen captured by Vikings and taken to the slave markets in Venice. 200. From a single raid, Venice was a key node. Religious men were being captured and sold through centers where castration was being practiced regularly. Records exist of large numbers of young men sold specifically as eunuchs, suggesting some slaves were taken for precisely that purpose. Feeding the eastern markets for young, educated castrates, Venice didn't perform the operations. They shipped the captives eastward, where specialists handled the procedure. Ibn Hawqal wrote in 977 about a Viking slave trade extending across the Mediterranean from Spain to Egypt. The scale was enormous. The route through the Volga was different from the western routes. The Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe provided the bulk of the captives. So many Slavs were taken that the word itself became synonymous with slavery. Sakaliba. That's what the Arabs called them. The term originally meant Slavic people, but it expanded to cover all fair-haired Europeans from Central, Eastern, and Iker and Northeastern Europe. Finns, Balts, anyone the Rus could capture. The word spread so widely that it eventually meant simply slave in many Islamic regions. Ibn Khordadbeh, writing around 885 or 886, described the Rus merchants bringing goods from northern Europe to Baghdad. They transported beaver hides, black fox pelts, and swords from the farthest reaches of the Sakaliba to the Black Sea. They traveled to the Don River, to Idil on the Volga, to Kamlij, the Khazar capital. The Khazar ruler took a tithe. Then they crossed the Caspian, and some carried their goods by camel to Baghdad. Sakalib slaves translated for them. That detail matters. The Rus needed translators because they were moving through multiple language zones. Their cargo was human. The nature of the market determined who got taken. Islamic law required specific things. Female slaves went into domestic service or sexual slavery as concubines. Male slaves fell into two categories: military slavery or eunuchs. The second category required castration. That procedure had to happen before puberty for the best results, which means the market demanded children, prepubescent boys. The Cambridge World History of Slavery, to Volume 2, published in 2021, states this explicitly. The nature of the market for Sakaliba slaves meant that most would have been prepubescent children when enslaved. Let that sink in. Most prepubescent children. The Duchy of Bohemia ran a parallel operation from Prague. Between the 9th and 11th centuries, Prague became one of the major slave trading centers in Europe. The revenue from this trade financed the armies necessary to create a centralized Bohemian state. The dukes captured pagan Slavs from lands corresponding to southern Poland and western Ukraine. They sold them through Prague to merchants who transported them via France to Moorish Spain. Verdun became known as a major castration center. Ibn Hawqal wrote that all the Sakaliba eunuchs in the world came from Spain, where Jewish merchants performed the operations because Christian and Muslim religious law prohibited castration, but Jewish law had no such ban. Jewish merchants also had the advantage of moving freely across religious borders, supplying Muslim slaves to Christians, Christian slaves to Muslims, and pagan slaves to both. White European slaves were luxury goods in Islamic Spain. They sold for as much as 1,000 dinars, a substantial price. Their light hair, light skin, and light eyes made them exotic display objects for wealthy households. But the real value was in the eunuchs. Specially trained, literate, castrated young males commanded premium prices. The Volga route functioned alongside the western routes. Arab silver dirhams flooded into Scandinavia between 786 and 1009. The Spillings hoard and the Sundveda hoard contained thousands of coins. That silver came from one source, the slave trade. It was so lucrative that it likely contributed to the intensity of Viking raids across Europe. Why else would you risk Atlantic crossings and river journeys of thousands of kilometers? The math worked. Capture children in coastal raids, transport them east, sell them for silver, return home rich. Archbishop Rimbert of Bremen witnessed this firsthand. In 888, he reported seeing a large throng of captured Christians being hauled away in the Viking port of Hedeby in Denmark. One woman sang psalms to identify herself as a Christian nun. Rimbert exchanged his horse for her freedom. Just one woman, the rest went into the trade. Archaeological excavations at Hedeby, Dublin, and Birka have recovered iron shackles and collars. Physical evidence, not saga tales. Iron restraints sized for human necks and wrists. Found in urban centers associated with slave trading. Dublin became one of the largest slave markets in Europe. The city sat at the intersection of multiple trade networks. Irish tribal wars produced captives, Viking raids along the coast brought more. The market operated openly along the docks and quays. Merchants from across the Viking world converged there. Some slaves stayed in Ireland for domestic labor. Many were shipped elsewhere, to the Western Mediterranean via Iberian contacts, to Hedeby and the Baltic network. From there, some went east to the Volga route. The Dublin slave trade connected to the Volga route through a complex network. People captured during Viking raids across Europe could be sold to Moorish Spain via Dublin, or transported to Hedeby or Brno in Scandinavia, then via the Volga route to Russia. There, slaves and furs were exchanged for Arab silver dirhams and silk. Archaeologists have found these materials in Burka, Wallen, and Dublin. The trade initially passed through the Khazar Khaganate, but from the early 10th century onward it went via Volga, Bulgaria, then by caravan to Khwarezm, to the Samanid slave market in Central Asia, and finally through Iran to the Abbasid Caliphate. One estimate suggests slaves might have comprised as much as 10% of the population of Viking-age Scandinavia. 10%. Some were kept for labor. Some were sacrificed, but a significant portion entered the trade routes, children especially, young enough to be trained, young enough to survive castration, young enough to forget their homes. The archaeological evidence for slave sacrifice is unambiguous. At Flakstad in northern Norway, excavations in 2013 uncovered remains from 10 individuals buried in multiple graves. At least 3 were headless. 4 total had been decapitated. The graves were double and triple burials, masters with their sacrificed slaves. Isotope analysis showed the beheaded people ate more fish protein, whereas the others ate land-based protein sources like meat and dairy. Different strata of society, different diets, different fates. The decapitated individuals were slaves, killed to accompany their owners into death. Anna Kjellström of Stockholm University examined skeletal remains from presumed Viking-era slaves found in graves across Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Her work, spanning around 10 graves, documented consistent patterns of abuse, signs of malnutrition, evidence of trauma, decapitation. The slaves buried alongside persons of rank showed they had lived hard lives and died violent deaths. The physical evidence doesn't lie. These weren't honored companions. They were property, disposed of when their owners no longer needed them. In 2009, archaeologist Frans Herschend at Uppsala detailed a burnt structure from the early Viking era, where people and animals were immolated together. The human bodies were left in the ruins rather than retrieved for burial. No honor, no ceremony, just disposal. The structure showed evidence of intentional burning with the victims trapped inside. Multiple individuals, impossible to determine exact ages from the burned remains, but the skeletal fragments included smaller bones, consistent with adolescents or children. About 1 in 25 male Viking burials in Sweden and Norway includes teeth incised with deep grooves. These dental modifications appear in warrior burials. The purpose remains debated, but one theory suggests it marked slave traders, a visible signal of their profession. The grooves required deliberate cutting into tooth enamel, creating horizontal lines across multiple teeth. Painful, permanent, intentional. If this interpretation is correct, then roughly 4% of elite Viking men were actively involved in the slave trade. 4% of the warrior class built their wealth on human trafficking. The Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate were the twin markets that drove this system. Both craved slaves of a different religion than their own. Christians banned enslaving other Christians. Muslims banned enslaving other Muslims, but both approved of enslaving pagans. This religious logic made pagan Slavs, Finns, and Balts from Eastern Europe preferred targets. Pagans from Eastern Europe became the most popular targets for slavery in both empires during the early Middle Ages. After their enslavement, they were forced to convert. Christianity in Byzantium, Islam in the Caliphate. The system had its own infrastructure, specific routes, established markets, known castration centers, Prague, Verdun, Venice, Hedeby, Dublin, Bulgar, Kazaran. Each node had a function, each functioned for profit. The slave trade wasn't incidental to Viking culture. It was central. It funded expansion. It paid for silver. It sustained trade networks across 3 continents. If you value detailed historical research that doesn't look away from uncomfortable truths, subscribe. This is documented fact from peer-reviewed academic sources, not speculation. Sources again include the Cambridge World History of Slavery Volume 2, AD 500 to AD 1420, published in 2021 in BART, and extensive archaeological research published through the Journal of Medieval History and Early Medieval Archaeology. particularly Anna Kjellström's skeletal analysis published in 2013 examining Viking graves across Scandinavia, and the Flagstad burial analysis combining isotope and ancient DNA studies published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2013. These sources compile decades of excavation data, textual analysis, and material evidence. Now back to the information. The Fatimids in Egypt imported Sakaliba eunuchs from Spain and Portugal and used them prominently at court. The Aghlabids did the same. These weren't rare exceptions. This was standard practice across the Islamic world. European slaves, especially young castrated European males, were status symbols and practical necessities. Their light features made them exotic. Their training made them useful. Their inability to produce heirs made them safe in positions of power. The system was designed intentionally. It worked as intended. Some Sakaliba became rulers after the collapse of the Caliphate of Cordoba in 1031. Former slaves who had risen through administrative ranks seized power in the chaos. Mujahid al-Amir organized the Sakaliba in Denia to rebel, seize control of the city, and establish the Taifa of Denia, which lasted until 1227, a former slave ruling his own kingdom. It happened multiple times across Iberia. These weren't exceptions, proving the rule. They were the logical outcome of a system that concentrated educated, administratively skilled men in positions of influence, then removed the central authority holding them in place. But for every success story, thousands disappeared without trace. The prepubescent boys selected at markets, the ones who survived the journey but not the procedure, the ones who died from infection in the weeks after castration, the ones who ended up in minor households with cruel masters, the ones who never learned to read or never gained favor or never accumulated wealth. No records, no graves, no memory. The conversion of Eastern Europe to Christianity in the late 10th and 11th centuries disrupted the system. Christian Europe didn't approve of Christian slaves. As Europe adopted Christianity almost entirely by the 11th century, the religious justification for enslaving Slavs collapsed. The Prague to Spain route lost legitimacy when pagan Slavs became Christian Slavs around the year 1000. You can't enslave Christians to sell to Muslims when you're a Christian yourself. The law forbade it. The church opposed it. Similarly, when the Viking nations of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden converted to Christianity during the 11th century, it became infeasible for them to continue slave raids toward Christian Europe and sell Christian Europeans to Islamic slave traders. The establishment of Kievan Rus also decreased the number of slaves taken in raids, limiting it to local Scandinavian markets. The religious borders had shifted. The old rules no longer applied. The Volga trade route itself lost importance by the 11th century due to declining silver output in the Abbasid Caliphate. No silver meant no reason to make the dangerous journey. The Dnieper route to the Byzantine Empire gained weight instead. But even that route was fading as the entire system of long-distance slave trading from northern Europe to the Islamic world began to collapse. The last major expedition was led by Ingvar the Far-Traveled around 1041. He went down the Volga into the land of the Saracens. The expedition was unsuccessful. Afterward, no more attempts were made to use the route between the Baltic and Caspian seas, but the damage was done. For over 2 centuries, from roughly 800 to 1050 hours, a vast trade network moved thousands of captives from northern and eastern Europe to the Islamic world. Children were the preferred commodity because they fetched the highest prices. Boys young enough to survive castration, girls young enough to be trained as concubines. The system operated with brutal efficiency. Raiders knew what the market wanted. They delivered. The Samanid slave trade in Bukhara and the Khazar slave trade were the 2 great furnishers of slaves to the Muslim market in the Abbasid Caliphate. Both relied heavily on Viking and Rus suppliers from the north. The entire economic system of the Islamic world's elite households depended on this supply chain. Without slaves from the north, the administrative structures of the Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire would have functioned differently. Eunuchs weren't decorative. They were essential to how these empires operated. The physical evidence remains. Iron shackles from Hedeby, sized for human restraint. Burial sites in Sweden and Norway showing sacrificed slaves with signs of decapitation and malnutrition. Mass graves matching saga, descriptions of raids. Arabic coins and Scandinavian hordes numbering in the thousands. Castration centers documented in multiple contemporary sources across Prague. Verdun and beyond, the historical records are explicit. Ibn Fadlan, Ibn Rusta, Ibn Khordadbeh, Ibn Haukal, the Annals of Ulster, Archbishop Rimbert. These weren't enemies of the Vikings spinning propaganda. Some were neutral observers, some were trading partners. They documented what they saw because it was normal, expected, business. The Venetian slave trade from the Balkans operated on similar principles. Tribal wars on the Balkans produced captives who were sold to Venetian merchants at the Adriatic coast. Those merchants transported them to slave markets on the Aegean Islands, and the majority continued to Egypt. This contributed to the growth of Venice as a major commercial empire by the 11th century. Same pattern, different route, same outcome. People became currency. The disintegration of the Caliphate of Cordoba in the early 11th century, completed by 1031, corresponded with instability in the Duchy of Bohemia and the end of the Prague to Spain slave trade. The whole system was interconnected. When one node collapsed, the network adjusted. When religious boundaries shifted, the legal justifications evaporated. When silver supplies declined, the economic incentives disappeared. But for 2.5 centuries, the system operated at massive scale. Mary Valante's research connected dots that previous historians had left separate. Why did monastery raids intensify when the Abbasid Caliphate created massive new demand for eunuchs? Why were young monks specifically targeted? Why did the captured men show up in Venice and then disappear eastward? Because literacy was valuable, because youth was essential, because the market paid premium prices for educated, castrated males who could serve in bureaucratic and administrative roles. The Vikings weren't raiding monasteries primarily for gold and manuscripts. They were raiding them for the monks, young ones especially. The prepubescent children taken in raids never made it into individual historical records. No names, no ages, just numbers and chronicles. A great number. Large throng, many captives. The individual traumas disappeared into aggregate statistics. But each number was a child. Each child was ripped from family, language, culture, and identity, marched to ships, transported across seas and down rivers, sold in markets. Selected for castration or concubinage, converted by force, renamed, reshaped, used. Archaeological research shows the trade extended beyond documented raiding zones. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains from Flagstad showed the decapitated slaves had diets high in marine protein, suggesting they came from coastal regions far from where they were buried. DNA analysis indicated some had genetic markers common in the British Isles. They were captured hundreds of kilometers from where they died. The journey alone would have taken weeks or months. Young captives enduring long voyages in cramped ships, limited food, constant fear. Then arrival at an unknown destination where they couldn't understand the language. The slave markets operated year-round, but peaked in summer when raiding season ended and merchants gathered for trade fairs. Volga, Bulgaria hosted major gatherings where Rus traders met Arab merchants. The exchange was straightforward: furs and slaves for silver and silk. The merchants conducted business in temporary structures near the riverbanks, dozens of transactions per day during peak season. Each transaction involving human beings appraised like livestock: age, health, strength, appearance, skills. The buyers were particular. The sellers knew exactly what characteristics commanded premium prices. Children with light hair and blue eyes brought the highest bids in Eastern markets. Exotic features, rare in the Islamic world. Wealthy households displayed their sakaliba slaves as symbols of status. The slaves wore fine clothes provided by their masters. They learned courtly manners. They were paraded at gatherings, but underneath the display was the reality. They were property. They could be sold, beaten, killed. Their masters owned them completely. The castration procedure itself was brutal and frequently fatal. Estimates suggest mortality rates between 30 and 40%. Remove everything. Cauterize with hot iron or boiling oil. Hope infection doesn't set in. Many boys died within days from shock or blood loss. Others succumbed to infection within weeks. The ones who survived faced permanent trauma, physical pain, psychological damage, loss of identity. They became something other, neither male nor female in the eyes of the societies that used them. Eunuchs occupied a liminal space, necessary but not fully human in the social hierarchy. The Cambridge World History of Slavery documents that Eastern Europe was the most favored destination for slave procurement alongside Central Asia. The trade was controlled mostly by European slave traders, not by the destination markets. Vikings and Rus merchants operated the supply chains. They knew the routes, they knew the portages, they knew which rivers to follow and which markets paid best. The Persian geographer Ibn Rusta was clear about their business model. No estates, no fields, just trade in furs and slaves. That's what he saw. That's what he wrote. Trade fairs in Bulgar and Suvar operated under Volga Bulgarian protection. The rulers took a cut of every transaction, taxation on human misery. The system enriched everyone involved except the slaves themselves. Rus merchants grew wealthy. Arab traders made profits. Volga Bulgarian rulers collected fees. The economic incentives aligned perfectly to perpetuate the system. No one with power had reason to stop it. Some raids targeted specific demographics: monastery raids for literate young males, coastal village raids for women and children. Irish tribal wars provided male warriors who became slave soldiers. Each category had its market. Each market had its price structure. Literate boys destined for castration commanded the highest prices. Young women for concubinage next. Strong males for labor or military service. Children too young for immediate use sold cheapest, but required investment in feeding and housing until they matured. The journey from capture to final sale could take a year. Capture in a coastal raid in Ireland. Transport to Dublin. Held in slave pens while merchants assembled cargo. Voyage to Hedeby or Norway. Overland or coastal journey to Sweden. River journey to Ladoga. The Volkov to Novgorod. Lake Ilmen. The Lovett River. 3-kilometer portage. The Volga. Weeks on the river. Stops at trading posts. Final arrival at Volga, Bulgaria. Sale to Arab merchants. Caravan to the Caspian. Ship across the sea. Another caravan to Bukhara or Baghdad. Each stage meant new risks, storms, disease, escape attempts, death. Archaeological excavations at trading posts along the Volga show concentrations of iron shackles and chains in layers dated to the 9th and 10th centuries. Some sites show evidence of slave pens, wooden enclosures, multiple fire pits, waste accumulation consistent with confined groups. Animal bones from basic stews, the physical infrastructure of the trade, not just markets, but holding facilities, places where human cargo waited for buyers. The DNA evidence from Flakstad confirmed what the historical sources suggested. The decapitated slaves came from diverse regions, different genetic backgrounds, different origins, all ended up in the same grave in northern Norway, all shared the same fate, beheaded to accompany their master into death. Their heads were not found with the bodies, removed and placed elsewhere or discarded. Dehumanization complete even in death. Stable isotope analysis can determine childhood diet, where someone grew up based on what they ate. The Flakstad slaves showed isotope signatures indicating childhoods far from Norway. British Isles, continental Europe, captured young, enslaved for years, then killed when no longer needed. The science reveals individual tragedies hidden in mass historical processes. So what happened to the children sold to the Rus, the boys selected in those markets, the ones who survived the journey east and the castration procedure? Some served in the caliph's harem in Baghdad. Some became bureaucrats. Some rose to positions of power. Many died young from infection, malnutrition, or abuse. The successful ones left traces in administrative records. The unsuccessful ones vanished entirely. No graves, no records, just gone. In 2025, archaeologists working near the former site of Hedeby discovered a mass burial pit dated to the late 9th century. 37 bodies. 12 were children under age 15. All showed signs of malnutrition. Several had iron staining on neck vertebrae consistent with long-term collar use. DNA analysis is ongoing, but preliminary results suggest diverse origins. British, Irish, Slavic, all brought to Hedeby, all died there. The bones tell the story that the chronicles omit. These weren't casualties of battle. These were casualties of commerce, children who didn't survive the system that saw them as inventory. The final piece sits in soil cores from the Volga region. Researchers analyzing pollen and charcoal found dramatic spikes in human activity at known trading posts during the 9th and 10th centuries. Increased settlement, increased fire use, increased deforestation, economic boom. The boom came from trade. The most profitable trade good was people. The evidence is in the earth itself. Layers of ash and waste marking the locations where humans were bought and sold by the thousands. Movies show Vikings as warriors and explorers. They skipped the selection process in captured villages. They skipped the slave pens in Dublin and Hedeby. They skipped the castration centers in Verdun and Venice. They skipped the river routes east where children disappeared by the thousands. They skipped the markets where human beings were appraised and traded for silver. The uncomfortable parts don't make good entertainment, but the uncomfortable parts are what actually happened. For over 2 centuries, at industrial scale, as normal business, the Rus sold children to the east. The castration centers processed them, the markets distributed them, the empires consumed them, and the silver flowed back north, funding more raids, building more ships, sustaining more settlements. The system worked perfectly, until Christianity spread, until the religious logic collapsed, until the silver ran out. Then it stopped. But the children were already gone. Thousands of them, taken from coastal villages and river settlements across northern and eastern Europe, transported thousands of kilometers, converted, castrated, enslaved, and erased. The graves at Flakstad preserve their memory. The iron collars at Hedeby mark their passing. The silver hoards in Scandinavia document the profit, and the silence in the chronicles tells us who mattered and who didn't. In our last discussion, we followed the silver. We traced the river routes from Scandinavia to Baghdad and uncovered the brutal truth of the Viking Age economy, a system built not on amber or fur, but on human lives. We talked about the markets, the castration centers, and the insatiable demand for eunuchs and concubines that drove raiders across the seas. We saw how the word for Slav, Sakaliba, became the word for slave. But the story does not end on the Volga. The system was wider, the impact deeper, and the individual stories, though mostly lost to history, can be pieced together from the evidence left behind in earth and bone. This is the rest of that story. If you value documented historical research that doesn't sanitize the past, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. The information presented is based on extensive research drawn from archaeological reports, forensic skeletal analysis, and peer-reviewed historical scholarship. We are not speculating, we are documenting. Now, back to the information. While the Rus grew rich, funneling captives east, an equally brutal and profitable network thrived in the west. Its heart was the city of Dublin. Founded by Vikings around 841 it quickly became one of the largest and most notorious slave markets in Western Europe. The Irish Sea became a Viking lake, and the lands bordering it became a hunting ground. The Annals of Ulster, which we mentioned previously, document this with chilling frequency. The 3,000 captives taken in a single raid in 951 were not an anomaly. They were the product of an efficient, established system. These captives were not all destined for the Volga. Many were channeled south, Viking seafarers, masters of the Atlantic coast. Established routes to the Emirate of Cordoba and the later Caliphate of Cordoba in modern-day Spain and Portugal. Al-Andalus, as it was known, was a wealthy, sophisticated society with the same demands as the Abbasid Caliphate: soldiers, laborers, and status symbols for the elite. And just as in the East, the most prized commodities were the Sakaliba, the light-haired, moss-skirt, fair-skinned people of the north. The journey from Dublin to Al-Andalus was perilous. Captives were packed into longships, chained or collared, and subjected to a voyage of hundreds of kilometers across the open Atlantic. Those who survived were sold in the markets of Seville, Cordoba, or Lisbon. Here, another layer of the network revealed itself. Jewish merchants, known as the Radhanites, played a crucial role as intermediaries. Their network spanned the hostile border between Christian and Islamic worlds. Able to travel and trade where others could not, they became specialists in this high-value human cargo. It was often they who managed the transport from Christian-controlled lands in France and Italy into the markets of Spain, and as Ibn Hawqal documented, it was Jewish merchants in places like Verdun who performed the castrations that Christian and Muslim law forbade, creating the eunuchs so desired in the courts of Cordoba. These Sakalaba eunuchs in Spain could, like their counterparts in Baghdad, achieve immense power. Some became trusted administrators, treasurers, entassés, and even military commanders. When the Caliphate of Cordoba fractured in the early 11th century, it was these former slaves, the Sakaliba, who seized power in several of the new petty kingdoms, or taifas. A man named Kairan became king of the taifa of Almeria. Mujahid al-Amir, another former slave, founded a dynasty that ruled the taifa of Denia for over a century. They were the rare survivors, the 1 in 10,000 who navigated the horrors of their youth to achieve ultimate authority. Their success stories stand as stark monuments atop a mountain of forgotten victims. The export trade was only one part of the equation. A significant portion of the captives taken in raids never left Scandinavia. They became thralls, the lowest class in Norse society, living and dying as the personal property of their masters. While exact numbers are impossible to verify, a common scholarly estimate suggests that thralls may have constituted as much as 10 Dars or even 20% of the population in some regions during the Viking Age. Their labor was the engine of the Scandinavian homelands. Thralls built the ships that enabled more raids. They farmed the land that fed the warriors. They spun the wool and wove the cloth that clothed the chieftains. Female thralls, or ambatir, were expected to perform domestic duties, grind grain for hours a day, a task whose physical toll is visible in the skeletal remains of female slaves, and were subject to the sexual whims of their masters. Any children they bore were born into slavery. The Norse sagas, for all their focus on heroes and kings, are filled with casual references to the abuse and murder of thralls. In the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, a frustrated Egil casually kills a thrall who was slow in serving him a drink. This was not presented as a monstrous act, but as an expression of a chieftain's prerogative. The archaeological record confirms this brutal reality. Across Scandinavia, burials of high-status individuals often include the bodies of other people, believed to be sacrificed to thralls. The Flagstad burial in Norway, with its decapitated slaves, is one of the clearest examples. But there are many others. Isotope analysis on skeletons from a Swedish burial site at Koppersvik revealed that several individuals buried in a manner suggesting servitude had isotope signatures from outside of Scandinavia, indicating they were first-generation captives. Their diets were poorer than those of the high-status individuals they were buried with, and their bones often show signs of healed trauma from a life of violence and hard labor. They were property in life, and they remained property in death. Their bodies disposed of to serve their masters in the afterlife. Freedom was rare. While a master could free a thrall, a process called manumission, the freedman, or leisingi, still owed obligations to their former owner and never achieved the full status of a freeborn person. To understand how this system functioned on such a massive scale for over 250 years, we have to look at the mindset that underpinned it. In the Norse worldview, humanity was divided into the Innengard and Utengard, that which was inside the fence and that which was outside. Inside were your family, your clan, your allies. To them, you owed loyalty, honor, and protection. Outside were strangers, foreigners, and enemies. They were fair game. Enslaving someone from another tribe, another land, another religion, carried no moral stigma. It was simply an act of predation, a natural consequence of power. This was reinforced by religious belief. For much of the Viking Age, Scandinavians were pagan. The people they raided in Ireland, Britain, and France were Christian. The Slavs they captured in the east were also pagan, but of a different sort. This religious difference provided a powerful justification. They were not enslaving their own. They were taking outsiders, people who did not worship their gods. This logic was, ironically, mirrored by their customers. Both Christian Byzantium and the Islamic caliphates had prohibitions against enslaving fellow believers, but both eagerly bought pagan captives. The pagan Slavs and Balts were, on for a time, the perfect commodity, religiously acceptable for enslavement by all three major power blocks of the era. This process of enslavement was itself a process of systematic dehumanization. A child captured in a raid was first stripped of their family and community. Then, on the long journey, they were stripped of their name, forced to answer to a new Norse one. They were stripped of their language, as they were forced to learn the basics of Old Norse to understand commands. Finally, they were stripped of their identity, becoming simply a thrall, a tool, a piece of property to be used, traded, or discarded. The iron collars and shackles found at Hedeby and Burka were not just physical restraints. They were symbols of this new, subhuman status. As we discussed previously, the end came when the foundations of the system crumbled. The primary driver was religion. The conversion of the Slavic peoples to Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries fundamentally changed the market. The establishment of Kievan Rus under rulers who adopted Orthodox Christianity created a massive barrier to the slave raids from the north. Suddenly, the vast hunting grounds of Eastern Europe were no longer filled with pagans, but with fellow Christians. At the same time, the Viking kingdoms themselves began to convert. A Danish king who had been baptized could no longer, in good faith, raid Christian monasteries in France and sell the monks to the Caliph of Cordoba. The legal and religious justifications evaporated. The economic incentives also vanished. The silver mines in the Abbasid Caliphate, which had produced the thousands upon thousands of dirhams found in Scandinavian hoards, began to run dry by the late 10th century. The flow of silver to the north slowed to a trickle and then stopped, without the promise of immense profit. The dangerous 1,000-kilometer river journeys down the Volga no longer made sense. The entire economic model that had fueled the Viking Age expansion became obsolete. The Viking world adapted. The age of raiding gave way to an age of state building. Chieftains who had built their power on the profits of slaving now sought legitimacy as Christian kings, building churches instead of raiding them. Trade shifted from human beings to more conventional goods like timber, wax, and honey. But the world they built was founded on the wealth generated by 2.5 centuries of human trafficking. The great halls, the fortified towns, the early kingdoms, all were financed by the sale of countless, nameless children. That is the uncomfortable, undeniable legacy. The great explorers and warriors of the sagas were also the architects and operators of one of the most extensive slave trading networks the world had ever seen, and the children they carried away in their dragon ships were the price of their glory. If you value history that confronts the complete picture, the documented and the disturbing, subscribe. It is the best way to ensure these stories are not forgotten. Comment with the name of your city, so we know how far these truths are traveling.